The HOA thought they could scare my wife with police. They had no idea who she really was. It was one of those mornings that feels ordinary in every possible way. The kind you don't remember unless something goes wrong. The sun was out but not too bright. The neighborhood quiet except for a few distant lawnmowers and birds perched along the power lines. My wife had stepped outside after breakfast to take care of a small issue near our driveway, something minor that most people wouldn't give a second thought to. A loose trash bin that had tipped overnight. A box left too close to the curb. The kind of everyday stuff that happens when people actually live in a neighborhood. There was no rush, no tension, no sense that this moment would turn into anything more than a forgettable part of the day. Our street has always been calm. Families wave at each other. Kids ride bikes. And people mostly mind their own business. That's why the HOA always felt unnecessary to us. We paid the fees, followed the basic rules, kept our place clean. It never caused problems. My wife, especially, believes in respecting the community. She is polite, composed, and not the kind of person who argues over nonsense. That morning, she was dressed casually, hair pulled back, phone in her hand, focused on what she was doing, not looking for attention, not trying to make a statement, just handling her business. That's when the HOA president showed up. She didn't walk over calmly or greet us like a neighbor. She marched across the sidewalk with that tight, irritated look people get when they feel powerful and are eager to use it. Before my wife could even finish what she was doing, the HOA president started talking, correcting her tone sharp, impatient, and loud enough to carry down the block. She pointed at the driveway and began listing violations that sounded ridiculous even as she said them. The bin was out of compliance. The placement was against HOA standards. The timing was unacceptable. None of it made sense, especially considering other houses had far worse things sitting out in plain view. My wife stayed calm. She always does. She explained that she was already fixing the issue and that it would be handled within minutes. She spoke respectfully, without attitude, the way any reasonable adult would. But reason wasn't what the HOA president wanted. She cut my wife off mid-sentence and warned her that this wasn't a discussion. She said she had already documented the violation and that further non-compliance would lead to consequences. The word consequences hung in the air, heavy and unnecessary. I stepped closer, not to argue, but to understand what the real problem was. That's when the HOA president turned her attention to me, clearly annoyed that someone dared to question her authority. She repeated the same nonsense, louder this time, making sure nearby neighbors could hear. It felt performative, like she wanted an audience. My wife gently suggested that if there was an issue, it could be handled through a notice like everything else. That suggestion seemed to flip a switch. The HOA president straightened up, crossed her arms, and said something that still feels unreal when I think about it. She said if the issue wasn't resolved immediately to her satisfaction, she would call the police, over a trash bin, over a minor, already being fixed situation. The threat wasn't subtle, and it wasn't said jokingly. She was dead serious. There was a moment of silence after she said it. Even the birds seemed quieter. My wife looked at her, clearly surprised but not intimidated. She calmly asked what law was being broken. The HOA president didn't answer directly. Instead, she went on about trespassing, disorderly conduct, and refusal to comply, throwing out words she clearly didn't understand, hoping they would sound official enough to scare us into submission. That's when it became clear this wasn't about rules or order. It was about control. The HOA president didn't like being questioned. And she especially didn't like that my wife wasn't backing down emotionally. There was no yelling, no disrespect from our side. But the lack of fear seemed to bother her even more than open defiance would have. She wanted dominance, and she wasn't getting it. My wife told her, calmly and firmly, that calling the police would be unnecessary and inappropriate. She reminded her that this was a civil HOA matter, not a criminal one. Instead of listening, the HOA president pulled out her phone and stepped a few feet away. Already dialing. She made a show of it, speaking loudly enough for us and the neighbors to hear. describing the situation as if my wife were some kind of problem resident causing chaos in the neighborhood. I remember feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. This was escalating for no reason. Neighbors began peeking out from their doors and windows, curiosity pulling them in. A few people whispered to each other. You could feel the tension spreading, fed by nothing more than ego and a clipboard. My wife stood there quietly while the call was being made. She didn't try to stop it. She didn't argue. She didn't look nervous. If anything, she looked disappointed, not scared, but disappointed that someone would abuse authority so casually. When the HOA president finished the call, she came back with a smug look, clearly convinced she had just taught us a lesson. She said, "The cops are on their way. Let us see how calm you are then." At that moment, I realized how badly she had misjudged the situation. She assumed uniforms automatically meant intimidation. She assumed authority only worked one way. She assumed my wife was just another resident she could push around. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the very system she was trying to weaponize against us was one my wife knew better than anyone else. As we waited, the neighborhood felt different. The air was heavier. Conversations stopped. Everyone sensed that something bigger than a trash bin was unfolding. The HOA president stood off to the side, arms crossed, occasionally glancing down the street like a child waiting to be proven right. My wife stood next to me, calm, composed, and silent. None of us knew how quickly things were about to turn upside down. The patrol cars didn't rush in with lights flashing the way you see on TV. Instead, they rolled slowly down the street, deliberate and controlled, as if the officers themselves were already unsure why they were there. Tires crunched softly against the pavement as the first car stopped near our driveway, followed by a second one pulling in behind it. The sight alone was enough to shift the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood. What had been a quiet residential street minutes earlier now felt tense, exposed, and strangely public. Doors opened up and down the block. Neighbors who had only half listened before were now fully invested. Some stood on their porches pretending to scroll their phones. Others leaned against their cars or peered through blinds, curiosity overpowering any sense of privacy. The HOA president noticed it too. She stood a little taller, adjusted her jacket, and wore the kind of expression that said this was exactly what she wanted: an audience and official backing. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands resting casually near their belts, eyes scanning the scene. There was no chaos to control. No argument in progress. No visible threat. Just my wife standing near the driveway, calm and still, and the HOA president already walking toward them, eager to speak first. She began explaining the situation before the officers had even fully closed their doors. Her words tumbling out quickly, sharpened with frustration and self-importance. She painted a picture of defiance and disorder that didn't exist. She talked about repeated violations, refusal to comply, and a homeowner who wouldn't listen. She gestured toward my wife as if pointing out a problem that needed to be handled. Her confidence was almost theatrical. She was certain that once the officers heard her side, the rest would fall neatly into place. One of the officers raised a hand gently, signaling her to pause. He asked to hear from everyone involved. That small interruption seemed to catch her off guard, but she stepped back reluctantly. The officer then turned to my wife and asked her what was going on. His tone was neutral, professional, and open, nothing like the confrontation the HOA president had promised. My wife explained everything calmly, from start to finish. She didn't rush. She didn't exaggerate. She described the minor issue, her attempt to fix it, and the sudden escalation. Her voice was steady, almost soothing, and it contrasted sharply with the tension the HOA president had tried to create. The officer listened closely, nodding slightly, occasionally glancing back at the driveway as if trying to locate the supposed problem. When he asked for identification, my wife handed it over without hesitation. No sigh, no complaint, no edge in her movements. The officer took the card and looked it over while the second officer began asking the HOA president follow-up questions. That's when things started to wobble for her. They asked what specific law had been broken. She responded with HOA rules. They asked what immediate danger had required police involvement. She talked about authority and respect. Each answer drifted farther from anything criminal or urgent. The officers exchanged brief looks, not dramatic, but telling. The mismatch between the call they had received and the reality in front of them was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the second officer studied my wife's ID more closely. His eyes lingered on it longer than expected. He looked up at her, then back down again, as if double-checking something. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. He didn't say anything yet, but something had clearly registered. The HOA president kept talking, sensing the attention slipping away and trying to pull it back. She repeated herself, raised her voice slightly, and emphasized her role within the neighborhood. She reminded the officers that she was in charge, and that residents were required to comply with her decisions. But the words didn't land the way they had before. The officers weren't reacting the way she expected. They weren't moving to issue warnings or demand compliance. They were listening and questioning. One officer stepped aside and spoke quietly into his radio, turning his back slightly to the group. The other asked my wife a few more questions, his tone respectful and precise. Neighbors noticed the shift too. The murmurs softened. A few people exchanged looks. Whatever outcome they had anticipated was starting to feel uncertain. The HOA president's confidence began to fray. She shifted her weight, crossed and uncrossed her arms, glanced at the officers' faces as if trying to read them. When one officer asked her again why the police had been called instead of handling the matter through normal HOA channels, she hesitated. That hesitation said more than any answer could have. The officer on the radio returned, his expression now noticeably different, more alert, more serious. He addressed my wife directly, using a tone that carried quiet respect. The HOA president noticed immediately. Her face tightened, confusion replacing the earlier smugness. This was not how this was supposed to go. The officers asked my wife to wait while they clarified a few things. She nodded and stepped slightly to the side. Still calm, still composed, the HOA president tried to interject, insisting that action needed to be taken now. But one of the officers gently asked her to give them a moment. It wasn't rude. It was firm. And it was the first time anyone had told her to step back. Around us, the neighborhood was completely silent now. No one pretended not to watch anymore. Every eye was fixed on the scene unfolding in front of our house. The patrol cars, the officers, the HOA president slowly losing control of the situation. It all felt surreal. What struck me most was how unnecessary all of it had been. None of this had needed to happen. A conversation could have ended it. A written notice could have sufficed. Instead, ego had turned a trivial issue into a public spectacle. The officers continued their quiet discussion, occasionally glancing toward my wife, then toward the HOA president. The balance of authority had shifted, even if no one had said it out loud yet. The power the HOA president thought she had summoned was no longer pointed where she intended. She stood there, suddenly unsure, realizing too late that calling the police hadn't guaranteed control. It had invited scrutiny. And that scrutiny was now turning in her direction. The street remained still, as if holding its breath, unaware that this was only the beginning of a much bigger reckoning. The shift didn't happen with a loud announcement or some dramatic gesture. It happened quietly, in a way only people paying close attention would notice. One moment, the officers were standing there treating this like a routine neighborhood call. The next, everything changed because of 5 simple words. My wife spoke words she didn't say loudly, didn't say angrily, and didn't say to intimidate anyone. She said them calmly, almost casually, as if she were stating the time. She looked at the officer holding her ID and said, "Before this goes further, you should know." She paused just long enough for him to look up at her again. "I am the county sheriff." The air seemed to freeze. For a split second, no one reacted at all. The officer's eyes flicked down to the ID in his hand, then back up to her face, this time with a completely different expression. His posture straightened instantly. His shoulders squared. The casual stance he'd been holding disappeared, replaced by something sharper, more formal. It was the kind of reaction that doesn't come from surprise alone, but from recognition of hierarchy, responsibility, and suddenly being very aware of where you stand. The second officer stopped mid-sentence while speaking into his radio. He turned slowly, his face tightening as the words registered. He walked back over, eyes now fixed on my wife, not with suspicion, but with a kind of startled respect. He asked her to repeat herself, not because he doubted her, but because his brain needed confirmation. My wife repeated it, just as calmly. No raised voice, no emphasis, no power play. The HOA president laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh yet. It was the dismissive kind, the laugh of someone who believes they've just heard something ridiculous. She waved her hand slightly and said something along the lines of, "That's not funny." As if my wife had just made an inappropriate joke to get out of trouble. That laugh would haunt her later. The officers didn't laugh. Instead, one of them took a small step back. Then another. He cleared his throat and addressed my wife again, this time using her title without being prompted. The change in tone was immediate and unmistakable. The conversation was no longer casual. It was procedural, respectful, careful. The second officer asked for verification, already pulling his radio closer. My wife nodded and told him exactly how to confirm it. She didn't reach for anything. She didn't flash a badge dramatically. She simply stood there, confident that the truth didn't need theatrics. The HOA president's smile began to fade. She looked from one officer to the other, waiting for anyone to call my wife's bluff. But no one did. Instead, the officer spoke into his radio again, this time with a tone that carried urgency and formality. Codes were exchanged. Names were mentioned. The response on the other end came quicker than before. When the confirmation came through, it was subtle but devastating. Yes. Confirmed. That was all it took. The officers, demeanor fully transformed. One of them nodded slightly, almost instinctively, then stepped aside to give my wife more space. The other apologized for the inconvenience, for the situation, for the misunderstanding. His words were sincere, not forced. This wasn't about embarrassment. It was about accountability. The HOA president finally realized something was very, very wrong. Her face drained of color. The smugness vanished completely, replaced by confusion, then disbelief. She stammered, insisting there had to be some mistake. She repeated her position again, as if HOA authority might somehow override county law enforcement leadership. The words sounded weak even as she said them. One of the officers turned to her, and for the first time since they arrived, his tone toward her was firm, not aggressive but authoritative. He explained that filing a police call under false pretenses was serious. He asked her directly why she had escalated a civil HOA matter into a law enforcement situation. This time, there was no room to dodge the question. She tried to explain. She talked fast, tripping over her words. She claimed she felt threatened, then corrected herself. She said she was just enforcing rules, then realized that wasn't helping either. Each sentence contradicted the last. The confidence she had strutted around with earlier was completely gone. My wife didn't interrupt. She didn't gloat. She didn't say, "I told you so." She simply stood there, watching, allowing the situation to unfold on its own. That restraint spoke louder than any threat ever could. This wasn't about power for her, it was about professionalism. Neighbors began whispering openly now. Someone across the street let out an audible gasp. Phones tilted higher. The story was writing itself in real time, and everyone could feel it. The woman the HOA had tried to humiliate wasn't just some homeowner. They had dragged the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the county into their petty power struggle. One officer asked the HOA president to step aside so they could speak privately. She didn't argue this time. She moved stiffly, her earlier bravado replaced with visible anxiety. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her phone, the same phone she had used minutes earlier with such confidence. The officers returned to my wife and asked if she wished to file a report. The question alone sent another wave of panic through the HOA president, who clearly overheard it. My wife paused before answering. The street was silent. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared. She said she wanted the incident documented. Nothing more. No revenge. No threats. Just the truth recorded exactly as it happened. That answer changed everything again. It told the officers exactly who they were dealing with. Someone who understood the weight of authority and respected it enough not to abuse it. Someone who knew consequences didn't need to be allowed to be effective. As the officers began documenting the incident, the HOA president stood off to the side, shrinking by the second. The power dynamic had flipped so completely, it was almost painful to watch. The authority she thought she controlled had turned around and exposed her instead. And all it took was 5 calm words spoken at the right moment. The neighborhood would talk about that moment for years, but the HOA president would never forget it. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It unraveled slowly, painfully, right in front of everyone who had gathered to watch. At first, the HOA president still clung to the hope that she could talk her way out of it. She stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly, nodding as if she were cooperating. But her eyes darted constantly between the officers and my wife. You could see the calculation happening in real time, how to regain control, how to shrink what had just happened into something manageable. But the officers weren't interested in managing appearances anymore. The tone had shifted completely. One officer began asking the HOA president detailed questions. Not accusatory, but precise. Dates, times, exact wording of the complaint. Why she believed police involvement was necessary. Each question peeled back another layer of the story she had confidently presented earlier. And each layer exposed how thin it really was. She stumbled over her answers, where she had once spoken loudly and with certainty. Now she hesitated. She contradicted herself. She tried to reframe events, minimizing what she had said earlier, insisting she hadn't meant for things to escalate. But escalation was exactly what she had done. And the officers knew it. They reminded her that misuse of emergency services wasn't a small matter. That filing a report based on exaggerated or false claims carried real consequences. The neighbors could feel it too. The energy in the air had changed from curiosity to something closer to awe. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was accountability unfolding in real time. People who had once quietly feared HOA authority were now watching it disintegrate under the weight of its own arrogance. The HOA president tried once more to assert her role, reminding the officers that she was responsible for maintaining order in the community. The words sounded hollow now. One officer responded calmly but firmly, explaining that HOA authority stopped at civil enforcement and that law enforcement answered to a completely different chain of command. It was a simple statement, but it landed like a hammer. She went quiet after that. The officers turned their attention back to my wife, asking if she felt harassed or intimidated. The question alone felt like a final reversal of roles. The woman who had called the police to assert dominance was now the one being scrutinized for abuse of power. My wife answered honestly. She said she felt the situation had been escalated unnecessarily and that the intent behind the call felt punitive rather than protective. That was enough. One officer stepped aside to write notes while the other explained to the HOA president what would happen next. The incident would be documented. A warning would be issued regarding misuse of police resources. Any further behavior of this nature could result in formal charges. Each sentence drained more color from her face. The authority she had wielded so freely minutes earlier was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous for her oversight. She looked around, suddenly aware of the audience she had invited. Neighbors weren't whispering anymore. They were openly watching, some shaking their heads, others staring with thinly veiled disapproval. The same people she had intimidated with fines and notices were now witnessing her being corrected by real authority. At one point, she tried to speak directly to my wife, her voice lower, almost pleading. She said there must have been a misunderstanding, that things didn't need to go this far. My wife listened without interrupting, then responded calmly that professionalism worked both ways and that respect couldn't be demanded, it had to be practiced. There was no anger in her voice, no satisfaction, just truth. That response seemed to break whatever composure the HOA president had left. Her shoulders slumped slightly. She nodded, not in agreement, but in resignation. The power she thought she controlled had not only slipped away, it had turned and exposed her actions to scrutiny she couldn't escape. The officers finished their documentation and explained the next steps. They reminded everyone present that HOA disputes were civil matters and that law enforcement should never be used as a tool for intimidation. The message wasn't just for her, it was for the entire neighborhood. It reset boundaries that had clearly been ignored for too long. As the patrol cars prepared to leave, the HOA president stood alone near the curb. No longer the center of attention she had wanted to be. People slowly began returning to their homes. Conversations buzzing now. Not with gossip, but with a sense of vindication. Something had shifted permanently in that neighborhood. Before leaving, one officer turned back to my wife and thanked her not for revealing her position, but for handling the situation with restraint. That acknowledgement mattered more than any apology. It confirmed what everyone watching had already realized. True authority didn't need to shout, threaten, or perform. It spoke quietly and carried weight. When the cars finally pulled away, the street felt different, lighter, freed from something unspoken that had lingered there for years. The HOA president gathered her things and left without another word. Her power dismantled not by force, but by her own choices. And in that moment, everyone understood a lesson she would never forget: authority abused will always collapse when faced with accountability. The aftermath didn't explode the way people might expect. There were no handcuffs, no shouting, no dramatic arrests that afternoon. Instead, what followed was quieter, slower, and far more permanent. When the patrol cars disappeared down the street and the neighbors drifted back into their homes, the neighborhood felt like it had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. The tension that had lingered for years, unspoken, tolerated, endured, had finally been exposed. For my wife and me, the first few hours were strangely calm. We went back inside, closed the door, and sat in silence for a moment, letting everything sink in. The adrenaline wore off, replaced by a heavy realization of just how unnecessary the entire situation had been. A trash bin, a phone call, an ego. That was all it took to reveal something deeply broken in how authority had been handled in our community. The documentation the officers completed didn't vanish into a drawer. It became part of an official record. Within days, follow-up calls were made. Emails were sent. Questions were asked by people far above the HOA president's pay grade. What had been a routine abuse of power suddenly had witnesses, paperwork, and accountability attached to it. The system she tried to misuse had turned into the very mechanism that examined her actions. Neighbors started talking, not just in whispers anymore. People compared notes. Stories surfaced about fines that never made sense, warnings that felt personal, rules enforced selectively. Residents who had stayed quiet out of fear or exhaustion now felt emboldened. They realized they weren't alone and they weren't powerless. The incident had cracked something open, and truth rushed in through the gap. The HOA board called an emergency meeting a week later. Attendance was higher than it had been in years. People who had never spoken up before asked questions. They demanded transparency. They wanted to know why police had been called over a non-criminal issue. They wanted to know how HOA authority was being used and who was watching the watchers. The answers were vague, defensive, and unsatisfying. That was when the consequences began to take shape. Formal complaints were filed, not just by us, but by multiple residents. The HOA president, once untouchable in her own mind, found herself answering to processes she could not intimidate. Legal counsel got involved. Policies were reviewed. The phrase, misuse of authority, appeared more than once in official correspondence. Her behavior was no longer a neighborhood rumor, it was a documented concern. Through all of this, my wife stayed deliberately distant. She didn't attend meetings. She didn't make speeches. She didn't involve herself beyond what was legally appropriate. That restraint mattered. It reinforced that this was never about revenge or flexing power. It was about boundaries, ethics, and consequences. The law existed to protect people, not to settle petty scores. Over time, the HOA president's influence weakened. Board members who had once backed her began to distance themselves. Decisions that used to pass unquestioned were now challenged. Votes were delayed. Oversight increased. Eventually, she stepped down quietly, without ceremony, without explanation. The woman who once threatened police over a trash bin left the position not with authority, but with scrutiny trailing behind her. The neighborhood changed after that. People smiled more. Conversations happened without fear of retaliation. Notices became reasonable. Enforcement became consistent. The invisible pressure that had hovered over daily life lifted. For the first time since we had moved there, the community felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not to a title. One evening, a neighbor stopped by to thank us, not for calling anyone out or making a scene, but for standing calmly and letting the truth do its work. Others followed. Quiet acknowledgments, shared relief, a collective understanding that what happened had mattered far beyond that single day. For my wife, the experience reinforced something she had always believed. Authority is only legitimate when it is exercised with humility. The badge she carries isn't a weapon, it is a responsibility. And that responsibility includes knowing when not to use it. The fact that she didn't intervene sooner, didn't shut things down immediately, allowed the system to reveal itself honestly. That honesty made the outcome stronger and harder to dismiss. As for the HOA, new policies were introduced. Clear guidelines about when law enforcement could be contacted. Mandatory conflict resolution steps. Training on appropriate conduct. Things that should have existed from the beginning, but only came into place after harm had already been done. Progress often comes that way, slow, reactive, but real. Months later, the incident is still talked about, but not with bitterness. It has become a reference point, a reminder of what happens when power is used carelessly. New board members mention it as a lesson. Residents share it with newcomers as context. The story has outgrown us, it belongs to the neighborhood now. And every time someone jokes about calling the cops over something trivial, the room goes quiet for a second. Everyone remembers. Everyone understands the line now. Justice didn't arrive with sirens or spectacle. It arrived through process, accountability, and restraint. And in the end, that was far more effective than any dramatic punishment could have been. The HOA learned a lesson it never expected to learn. The neighborhood learned it had a voice. And my wife proved, without ever raising her voice, that real authority doesn't need to announce itself, it simply stands. And the truth follows. If you enjoy real HOA stories where power trips backfire, hit subscribe and stay with us. More true stories are coming.